All right, here we go. Another edition of Radio Waves, a very special edition of Radio Waves, I might add. And my name is Mike Stark.
With Richard Wagoner.
And on this show, Richard and I spend a lot of time beating up and ranting about corporate radio. But this time we are joined by a couple of corporate radio execs who actually love the medium. What a concept, right? It is an absolute honor to be able to speak today with Emmis Communications CEO and founder Jeff Smulyan and Emmis President of Programming Rick Cummings. Jeff has a new book out called Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down, which details all that came beyond radio for him. And throughout the book, Rick plays an important role in the journey at Emmis that has turned into a lifelong working relationship and friendship, from what I read, based on their mutual love for radio. Thank you both for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mike. This is fun. Looking forward to it with you and Richard.
Likewise.
I loved your book, Jeff. I just loved your book. It is
Thank you.
It's so fun to read because you just feel like you're getting an insight into the entire, not only the industry, but I think the idea that it's for entrepreneurs is something I almost think everyone should read it. I'm going to have my son read it.
Thank you. Well, the response has been very, very gratifying, and it's been a labor of love and a lot of fun. I've had a lot of fun with the project.
So how did you guys meet? And didn't you actually work together on the air at one point?
Don't laugh at that. That's depressing. You laugh at that experience.
Yeah, sadly we did.
The first radio station I ever ran, we hired Rick. I think we hired Rick during my zombie state, my first 90 days. And he was a production person who was coming off a stellar career at WFMS, where I think they played you off. And we worked together. He then ended up doing the talk show, replacing our midday guy, David Letterman. Rick did that. And then Rick was program director. And then he went off to, WTIC in Hartford. But before that, I think probably the highlight of both of our careers is we did a Saturday sports talk show, and it was an early forerunner of bad sports talk. Probably, I think.
Are there air checks available of that anywhere?
God, no, I hope not.
Yeah, I would pray not. I would say I could probably sell all of Emmis to blackmail to not have those released.
Well, Richard touched on it, but let's start with the book. Tell us about the book. It's obviously more than just about broadcasting. It's about all of the things you've been involved with, including owning a baseball team, working for the government, and all sorts of other things. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, the genesis of the book was I have an 19-year-old daughter who is a freshman at Georgetown. And I would drive her to school every day from like kindergarten until she unceremoniously fired me when she got her driver's license. And we would just talk about life and the lessons I've learned and stories. And one day she said, Dad, you got to write this down. Nobody would ever believe these stories. And so when COVID came, I just started writing. And the next thing I knew, during some downtime, I had like 300 pages. And I sent it off to a couple of friends, and they said, you got a book here. So one thing led to another. I got a wonderful editor who was just fabulous and tightened things down and said, amplify this, cut this. And then we got an agent, we got a publisher, and the next thing you knew, we had a book. So it's all been fun.
That's great. That's great.
Positive things to come out of the COVID shutdown.
Yeah, probably never would have done it. I'm glad I did it. People said, boy, you told a lot of stories, and a lot of them are embarrassing stories. But, at this point in my life, you just tell, what happened, and I'm comfortable with what's on the pages of the book.
Now, since we are a radio podcast that centers on LA radio, we'd like to focus on one of the big success stories at Emmis here in LA, and that's Power 106, which was purchased by Emmis in 1984, if I'm not mistaken. Right. Tell us the story of how that station came into the Emmis portfolio and how you guys grew it.
Rick, you want to tell that one?
Well, I can take a shot at it with hopefully a little bit a correction from you because my memory is not as good seemingly as yours is, Jeff, having read your book. But yeah, we Jeff acquired the station. I believe it was for $12 million in 1984, and we had this sort of cherished notion of doing a different kind of adult contemporary format, what would eventually become Hot AC and very successful, but we were way ahead of our time, and it didn't work out so well. We had Robert W. Morgan as a morning guy, and we did that for a couple of years with a very spotty success. And I remember it must have been the fall of '85, heading into the beginning of 1986. We said, well, when the fall book comes out, if we don't hit a certain level, it was a modest level, we're gonna try something else. And we had been talking to some people about some kind of contemporary format that sort of took advantage of the changing melting pot in Los Angeles. And so, sure enough, the book came out, and it wasn't good. And on January 11th, 1986, we put on Power 106 on a Friday night. And I think we within just a few days, we were hearing the radio station coming out of cars on Sunset Boulevard. You never heard Magic 106. We were hearing it everywhere. And it felt like what it turned out to be, which was an immediate success.
What sort of research did you put into developing that format? Because obviously you had to look at the demo and all of that and figure it out.
Well,
Research wasn't nearly as sophisticated then as it is now, but we had done a little bit of research, and we had talked to a consultant named Don Kelly. And the whole premise was, is there a coalition of Hispanics, English primary Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians that we could put some music on the air that would appeal to that coalition? And it turned out there was. It was a rhythmic-based format. It would later become a rap format, but in the initial years was a sort of a dance rhythmic radio station. It was a combination of urban radio and danceable top 40. And I remember the record labels and the trades, they didn't know what to do with us. We weren't an urban station. We weren't a top 40 station. We didn't fit into any particular category. And they would come to us and say, we don't know how to categorize you guys. We don't even know which representatives to send over to try and get you to play records. And our response was, that's not our problem. That's your problem. We don't care. And I think that was one of the reasons it was so wildly successful. It just didn't fit into any of the traditional silos.
Well, I had teenage daughters at the time, and I got to tell you, they were locked onto that station. I listened to it whether I wanted to or not at the time. Because
That was true of Rick too. I might add.
And I mean, they just loved the station.
Well, and everything we did, from the music to how it was produced, I'll give Jeff some credit here. I can remember when it was an AC station, people would say, the problem is your signal's on Flint Peak, and that's just not a good signal like the Mount Wilson signals. Right. And you're never going to be successful with an AC station because your signal sucks. And then we put this thing on the air, and the ID was 76,000 watts of music power, KPWR Los Angeles. And those same people 6 months later were saying, well, no wonder this is successful. You got one of the biggest signals in Southern California. It's the same signal.
By the way, that catchphrase was genius, I thought. Absolutely genius.
We learned early on in this first station, deal with your strengths, reposition your weaknesses. And, so we did that. It was like, okay, the weakness is signal strength, but wait a minute, because we're on Flint Peak, we got I think it was actually 72,000 watts, but
who's counting?
And we just drove that home. And, it was like the old bit, you play too many commercials and you run an ad that says now playing less commercials than ever for 6 months, and you play more commercials and everybody goes, well, they're playing less commercials. This is great, And so the 72,000 watts of music power, yeah, pretty soon people said, oh my God, that signal's so strong. Yeah.
It also made for a fast moving tempo that matched the music. And with the 2 year top of the hour ID was just quick, and it was
everything we did, we would say, well, Kiss plays jingles. Let's not play jingles. We had a piece of equipment. It was just when digital processing was first beginning, and somebody went out and got a digital processor. And so we started doing digital processing because no one else was doing it. It was whatever we could think of that was different. We tried it.
Now, I understand from reading bits of the book that, Jeff, you had to pay out some bonuses because the station did so much better than you even expected, right?
Well, actually, the bet was that with Don Kelly, who, by the way, was a wonderful guy, but was really the guy who was totally instrumental in that station for 30 years is Rick Cummings. But I said, Don said, I think you can get a 4 or 5 share here. And I said, Don, you get a 5 share and I'll build a statue for you on Hollywood Boulevard. And the thing went all the way to a 6 in its first book, and Don graciously said, "Just pay me the cash," you said, and statues. We saved money on a statue, but I mean, it was one of those few times in your life when everything goes right, and we've all had them. And when they go right, you just worry about not letting hubris settle in because but it was a wonderful, fun experience.
One of the things that you mentioned in the book, and I actually remember it at the time and talking to the people because I was an intern there, which was so much fun being there. You kind of made me feel part of the family, Rick especially. But you didn't do traditional research. You actually went into nightclubs. You went into bars. You went into, I think you even went to colleges, things like that, and found out what people were listening to ahead of the game. What isn't on the radio yet? And I started thinking about that, and I started thinking, well, wait a minute, that's kind of what I've been saying for the last 10 years that radio should do to reinvent itself. So apparently I stole my idea from you. Tell us a little about that. How did you, I mean, that's totally different than most research would have been.
Richard, you may remember them. We had early on, really from the very beginning, we had a couple of mixed DJs named Boris and Chris. Yeah. And we would have Boris and Chris do remixes of regular rotation records. And they were also out in the clubs. And we would sit down with Boris and Chris and the other mixers and say, what gets people up on the dance floor, gets them excited. And we would take 1 or 2 of those records and play them like they were already hits. We would play them back then 100 times a week, which was unheard of. We had a stress rotation for new records, which no one was doing that. But we just said, we're going to make a bet here that these are going to be hit records, and we're going to play them like they already are, just play them all the time. And so, you get songs like Magazine 60's Don Quixote, which nobody played that record except us. And we played the hell out of it because every time we put it on at Florentine Gardens, 1,500 Latinos would get up and go crazy. And so we would do things like that. And I think that was one of the things that made the station kind of unique.
Absolutely. It's very forward thinking because so many of the stations, especially now, they sit back and you're researching songs that people already know rather than what they don't know. And
right.
Let's talk about mornings for a second. Now, obviously, Robert W. Morgan didn't make the cut after a certain amount of time, right?
Right.
And
and Robert was he was great for an AC station, but I still remember the rumor was that we were going to do something new. Jeff, you may remember this, but I think you were flying out to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And Robert was on the air. It was one of his last mornings on the air. And he said, the boss is coming out from Indianapolis. I think he's stopping in Detroit for the Curtis Blow records. So the rumor the rumor was beginning to circulate that something was going to change.
I thought his line was, they're going from a guy who does a lot of blow to a guy who's playing a lot of Curtis Blow or something like that. Yeah, and I loved Robert W. I listen, when I went to school at SC, I listened to Robert W. I mean, I was the biggest KHJ fan of all time. So hiring Robert W., and it was the twilight of his career and things weren't as good, but
right. No, you're preaching to the choir there. We both love the whole Boss Radio format. In fact,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
But then you brought in Jay Thomas. Was he the next one?
Yeah,
yep, he was.
And I got to tell you, and I've said this before on our podcast about Jay. I always felt that Jay was so good. I mean, people know him as an actor and they know him as other things, but he was so good. It didn't matter what format he worked in. He could have worked. It didn't matter what the records were that you were playing. He was just so good at doing what he does. The music was secondary.
That's right. I think he had a very successful run there at Power until he didn't. But if you look back at all the morning shows we built through the years, literally all of them didn't sound like radio morning shows. They were different, and we encouraged that. We just felt like we weren't necessarily going to be great at doing typical radio morning shows, but we could do something. It was something different that stood out on the dial, and Jay was a classic example of that. He wouldn't lead with the call letters. He wouldn't do a lot of the things that disc jockeys are supposed to do, right. And we didn't care. We were fine with that.
What made you choose him?
I forget who brought him to our attention, but he came out and we met on a weekend in Hollywood, I think at the Mondrian Hotel. And he proceeded to entertain everybody at the table for 3 hours during lunchtime. And he got up to excuse himself to go to the bathroom, we thought. And we said, this guy's great. He's going to be so different. Let's hire him. Well, little did we know he was actually in the gift shop charging a bunch of shit to our expense account to bring back to the table. But that kind of sealed the deal for us.
Oh my God. I mean, I don't think I want to tell the story of when he left, but one of my favorites, I guess we could tell it. Jay has passed away. About he was taping an hour and a half of the morning show and nobody knew about it. Yeah.
Well, you had another jock at another station that was doing that as well, if I remember correctly. Didn't Rick Dees do that at Movin'?
No, he did it at Kiss.
Oh,
he was showing up when he was at Movin', but he definitely was doing that. And I remember Kevin and Bean used to work for us, and they made their mark basically making fun of Rick Dees. And they would park the van in front of his house every morning and throw it to the van driver, and he'd say, "Yeah, it's 7:45. Rick hasn't come out of his house yet here in Toluca Lake."
I remember that.
Then you brought in Big Boy. Was he the next one, or
we brought in the Baker Boys. The
Baker
Boys had a really good run for a few years, and then we brought in Big Boy, and again they all kind of followed that same model of being very non-traditional. And as we got further into the hip hop world, we got more into the belief that you hire people who have something to say and who are of the culture, and we figured we can teach them how to say the call letters and how to do the business elements, but we can't teach them the culture, and we can't teach them how to speak to that culture. Those are things that come naturally to them, and that's kind of the model that we used pretty successfully.
Now, Richard and I talk a lot about how radio stations today do zero marketing or close to zero marketing. At least in LA, they don't. you guys did a lot of marketing, and did that help with the success of the station? I mean, I remember billboards and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I think that the thing that breaks
Oh,
my
sure. I mean, I think.
Go ahead, Rick.
Go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
Well, I think what breaks my heart is the industry stopped when the industry got too much debt, and you had all these companies with leverage and how do I cut my costs? Marketing got cut out. And, I think we lost our relationship with the American public because, you got to reintroduce yourself every day, and we didn't. And probably our greatest fun was doing all the marketing. Rick and I wrote the first spot for the company, probably the best spot we ever wrote 40 years ago, introducing WNS in Indianapolis. And it was so much fun creating marketing plans. And whether it was Indianapolis or St. Louis or Minneapolis or LA or New York. But you don't see it anymore. The industry is just, you don't see people. I mean, I have a friend who shall remain nameless who worked for us in a market and ran stations for us for 35 years. And now he's running a couple clusters for one of the giants. And he's got like 3 or 4 stations in each market, and he's got less than 10 people in the market. So this is not an industry that connects with people, can't relate to people, let alone marketing to people. And it breaks my heart. But that's where this industry is.
It breaks our heart too. Now, let's talk now about how you made history in sports radio.
Right.
Now, I find this interesting. You guys had really great success in music radio, yet both of you came to radio because of your love for sports, right?
Well, I think we're both sports fans.
Jeff did.
No, I think we're both. I mean, I didn't do play-by-play for Butler University. You did. So, I mean, come on, let's let the record straight.
Anyway, you ended up starting the first sports radio format, which was WFAN.
Right.
Can you talk about the origins and the growth of that station?
I can. The bitterness is still not left me yet. I wanted to do that format when I was at college at USC, and when we had our first AM station was WHN. We had the Mets, and I brought it up to the head of our programming, who should remain nameless. I don't remember him, but I think he's on this call. And he said, "What a stupid idea!" And we had a managers meeting, and Emmis is a very collaborative group. We vote, and it got voted down. And I'll never forget Steve Crane, who was one of my longest friends, who was now retired, but was with us, said, "What do you want to do?" When we walked out of the meeting, I said, "You can't lead where others won't follow. We're not going to do this." And the next day, Mr. Cummings and Doyle Rose walked into my office and said, "Look, we're doing really well everywhere, and we owe you one. So even though we think this is an epically stupid idea, we'll do sports radio as long as we don't have to be involved with the dumb idea." So for a while it was. Am I lying about anything there? So
that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, and so it was called Smulyan's Folly for a while. Jim Lampley called it the Vietnam War of Emmis. At 5:00, we'd be at a meeting and say, "Well, it's 5:00. We lost another $12,000 at Fan today." I mean, it was a disaster. I'll tell you one story I've told in the book, I think. And Mike Lynn was Don Imus's agent, and he was also Robert W.'s agent. And we met with Mike, and we were deciding. We had bought the NBC stations a year later, and we're meeting and deciding what to do with Don. And I said, let me see if I get this right. We have a radio station that's losing record amounts of money. We've got a baseball team in the 1988 Mets who probably have more drug problems than any team in the history of sports. And we got a morning guy who's been in and out of rehab for the last 4 years. What could possibly go wrong putting all this together? But we did it, and it worked, and the rest is history. Yeah.
Now, you have said in interviews and stuff that you think that sports radio is still a viable format, correct?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that and maybe give us some insight as to why it hasn't been super successful, say, here in LA?
Well, that's a 2-part question. Number one, Karl Marx used to say, this will be the last political part of the discussion, but Karl Marx used to say, religion's the opiate of the masses. Well, today, sports is the opiate of the masses. Everybody cares. As I always say, as life gets more complicated, you want to escape and, watch your team and lose yourself in a ball game. So it's something people really care about. And so I think it is always going to matter to people as long as you can talk about things that they care about. We used to joke in sports, it's the same thing as top 40, play the hits. Nobody wants to talk about roller derby or who's running at Santa Anita. They want to talk about the Rams or the Trojans or the Dodgers. So you play the hits. But the problem is LA, LA is just different. And I feel like I know it very well. It's a more transient town. People have more things to do. I've said, when you look at the affinity for sports, you go across the country, and when you get further west, the affinity declines. And I've lived this. I spent 3.5 years working on the Pac-12 issues for USC. And there's a difference. If you're in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or Columbus, Ohio, as opposed to Los Angeles, even when SC's great, there's not anybody in the state of Alabama or the state of Ohio that's not totally engaged in Ohio State and Alabama. But in Southern California, even if you've got 80,000 USC fans in the stadium, everybody else is at the beach or they're
Gotcha.
doing something else. And so it's an affinity issue, and it's why it's tougher. It's tougher in the West. It doesn't mean the Lakers, don't have a lot of fans, and SC does, but it's not the same affinity. And it by the way, it's true in Seattle, it's true in Portland, and it's true in San Francisco and San Diego. It's more of a West Coast transient thing.
Would you have tried sports radio in Los Angeles, or would you have already known that, thinking that it wouldn't be enough of
Well, obviously, if I had understood all that, I wouldn't have bought a baseball team in Seattle. That's another chapter in the book.
That was an interesting chapter, by the way. I got a lot of insight into that, and I realized, boy, you really took the brunt of the criticism.
Oh my God! Well, I have a favorite. Well, the book. I've had a favorite saying forever. The line between being a genius and an idiot is very fine. I've been on both sides. So one chapter is idiot to genius, WFAN, when it worked. And the other was genius to idiot when I was the absolute boy wonder in Seattle. I mean, I signed autographs, 30 minutes after the ballpark every night. And then I, went from genius to idiot. But yeah, I mean, you learn. It is, we specifically like New York because of the affinity for sports. There's no question. You always know there's much more affinity for sports in New York than there is in LA or San Francisco.
Even when the team sucks.
Yeah, even when the team sucks. That's exactly right. Yeah. Okay,
let's move on. We want to get both of your prognoses on the future of radio. And we'll start with the future of music radio. What do you see? Is there a future in music radio at all?
RC, you want to start with that one?
Yeah. I don't think there is much of a future musically for radio because people can get those songs any place these days, and they can get them without sitting through commercials if they want. And so I'm actually back involved a little bit at Power 106. Our friends at Morwello called and said, hey, could you help us out, give us some advice? And we've put on a new morning show called Brown Bag. It's the first time in 40 years I ever said to a brand new morning show, I don't care if you don't play any records, just talk. Yeah. Because I think that's the future of that station. When you can get Drake at a competitor, at two competitors or three competitors, not to mention Spotify and many other streaming platforms on demand, you're not going to be successful playing Drake records. You've got to really rely on what you do between the records. And so we are making a big bet on this young morning show team that they are going to set the station apart and really draw a big audience. But I think increasingly you'll see music stations needing to do what Woody does at Alt, and what many other great morning shows are doing on music stations. And you'll see those music stations try to spread that effort to other day parts. That's what I think.
Seeing it in the afternoon a little bit too.
Yeah, I think, listen, as long as you can create content that matters to people, and I think largely that's personalities, community involvement. It is very difficult, and I think we did this to ourselves. We saw it with Next Radio. You run a radio station that's running 16, 18, 20 units an hour, 24 units an hour, and you're just putting up a sign that says, please don't listen. And we've got competitors, you listen to some competitors, and before they run paid spots, they run 4 or 5 minutes of promos for other ventures that they have. And it's just, and their theory is, look, this inventory, we don't care. We got plenty of inventory. Well, the problem is that creates in the mind of the consumer that there's just, as Rick said, there's better, easier places to go to get the same stuff.
Yeah, and also the personalities that actually are on the air are reading cards, and they're not being personalities. And Richard and I always talk about, exactly what Rick had just said a minute ago about it's what comes between the records that's the most important. Yeah. And it always was. It was with Boss Radio. It was with any of the great radio stations. And that also might be a reason that, where sports radio could have some viability. And you sort of did that by putting Don Imus on in the mornings, because he wasn't just about sports. He was about everything.
We actually looked at Don when we first started the station, because in those days it was like, does anybody want to hear about sports at 6 o'clock in the morning? And so we said, well, Imus is a perfect way to test it, because he loves sports, but he also loves everything else. Yeah. But he was under contract at NBC, and he had his problems then. But he was the perfect transition, because he could talk about sports. Still, my favorite sign off in all of my years was the Imus sign off at 10 in the morning, when he said, "This concludes the entertainment portion of today's programming. For the next 20 hours, you get your mindless drivel from morons who are going to talk about sports and know nothing about anything. So if you want to be entertained, tune back in tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. And it's one of the great bits of all time."
That is awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Yeah.
Have you gotten, there's two questions I want to ask, and one's related to something earlier, but you were kind of brutally honest in your talking about Next Radio. And have you gotten any pushback from any of the people you mentioned?
Well, my goal in the book was to sell a lot of copies, or have Bob Pittman buy 100,000 copies and burn them. I don't know what he's done. No, I mean, I could, because people said, I've had some fascinating reactions. It's gotten some publicity. I can't tell you how many people called and said, well, you said what we've all known for years. You're the first person to say it out loud.
You confirmed everything that I had heard.
Yeah, and everybody knew it. There was no secrets. There was nobody in the industry who didn't say that. Some of the stories, the 46 Studebaker story, I couldn't tell Next Radio without it. My book is not designed to be snarky, but the Next Radio story was an important story, and you couldn't tell it without knowing that Pittman was lurking in the background trying to sabotage it all day long. Yeah. It's funny. I've had people thank me for saying what they all knew. And I said, it kind of amazes me that after a decade, I'm the first person to actually say it publicly. I mean, although there've been some analysts, I guess, who've said
without Clear Channel and iHeart and Pittman.
Yeah.
Emmis, do you think the industry itself would be a lot healthier so that Emmis wouldn't have had to sell some of their stations to to basically pay off a lot of their debt?
Well, I can't blame them for my debt. But
you paid yours off. They didn't.
Yeah, I paid all mine off. It's all been paid off. But I mean, I think, and it certainly is not a Bob Pittman problem. By the way, when Bob Pittman got to iHeart or Clear Channel, the company had over $20 billion of debt. So he just basically left it the same. And when it went bankrupt, it still had $20 billion of debt. He didn't pay anything off. But I mean, the industry took on too much debt. The book talks about all of it. I don't want to bore you with it now. But I mean, the industry took on too much debt. And then with too much debt, they added inventory and they cut people. And it was just a vicious cycle. And the problem is, in an industry that's not growing now, would the industry have grown if we were running 6 units an hour Probably not, but I think the declines would have been much less precipitous.
Yeah, and this kind of leads into one of the final questions that we have for you. Jeff, you lobbied for the Telecommunications Act in 1996.
Yes.
And
yes.
in the book, you admit that the legislation was a mistake. What was your thinking at the time that you thought it might have a positive effect? And what has happened instead?
And I have mixed emotions. I think in the book I talk about Tom Malusky, who was head of Greater Media, and at the time Tom said, "You'll be sorry," and there were a couple of other people, and there was so much fervor about, look, we have to be able to compete, with all these other industries, and we're limited to 12 stations. The funny part about it was we all thought, gee, if you could own 4 AM and 4 FM stations in a market, and you could own 12 markets, you own 96 stations, that'd be the greatest thing in the world. Well, at the last minute, it was unbeknownst to us. I think Lowry and Eddie Fritz and Trent Lott made it unlimited. We all said, who in the world could run 1,000 radio stations? It's not possible. 25 years later, I'm telling you, that was right. Nobody's been able to run that many stations.
Yeah.
But I think we all thought, it's going to, and it did. It opened up capital. Wall Street fell in love with us. But it's like anything else. It leads to excess. And there was so much capital and people were bidding up prices. We got into TV. There's a point in the book where we said, this is crazy. A radio station that last week was 10 times cash flow. Today is 23 times cash flow. And it's based on, an industry that for years grew at 4 to 5 to 6% a year, produced very nice, steady cash flow growth. But you couldn't sustain a 23 times purchase with that kind of growth. So it just built upon itself. And then you had all the machinations from Wall Street. Could it have come differently even if we'd been deregulated? Sure, it could have. This is just the way it evolved.
So what do you see as the future of corporate radio?
Well, I still think there's a place for this medium. There always will be. I think it's very hard. People always say there's too much debt. And I know I had to laugh because iHeart, when they went bankrupt, they dropped their debt from 21 billion to 6 billion. And in one of their press releases, they said, what a great achievement. We've cut $15 billion off of this debt. And I went, well, you went bankrupt, for God's sakes. Of course you cut 15 billion. But the problem is, and you've seen this, is you've had the lenders who say, well, let's still leave it at like 5 or 6 times. So iHeart, and the problem is in a declining business, 5 or 6 times can be 7 or 8 or 9 times, and then you got a death spiral. So it's really, really hard. If you had somebody who had zero debt, and you could run, one of the things about Next Radio is we thought that if we could run location-based advertising based on data, that we could charge a lot more and people cut their unit loads. Now, I can also tell you that, that was, a 55-yard punt into the wind. But we thought that, but we said, the idea was, how do we save this business?
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered that question.
No, that was that.
You've also moved into podcasts too, so you're obviously seeing a future for entertainment.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. I think this question is actually for Rick, and now that he's back with Power, I think it kind of fits as well. I've always been curious, what made the decision to move into hip hop outside of the rhythmic dance music?
It died. We had 4 or 5 great years, and then suddenly we were 10th in the market, and KISS was killing us. And we went in the field and we did a little research, and I still remember sitting in behind the mirror and watching some focus groups of young Latinas talking about music somewhere in Hollywood or East LA or someplace, and they all are talking about how they hate the cover girls and expose, and that's old news, and they're into this thing called hip hop. And we went to school pretty quickly to learn what hip hop was, and we started evolving in that direction, and immediately gained some of our ratings back, and so we made the evolution much quicker. I think it took us about a year and a half, and pretty soon it was all hip hop.
So in a sense, you reinvented radio twice.
Yeah, and I want to jump in, and as you know, I don't say nice things about him all the time, but but he is the person in this country who saw this, and he changed it, and he was out on a limb. Fortunately, he had brain dead senior management. We didn't know what the hell he was doing, so when he said he would do this, no, I mean seriously, it was controversial. So he can't play rap, he can't play hip hop, and Rick said, "I'm telling you, this is the future," and he saw it. It was controversial at the time. And that was really the transformation of hip hop to mainstream. It may have started 50 years ago, but it really went mainstream with those two radio stations in New York and LA.
I don't know if you remember, but watching the Super Bowl halftime show 2 years ago, and I remember talking to friends in New York, and we were like, "My God, that's everything that Power 106 and Hot 97 became famous for." It was right there in that halftime show.
Yeah, it absolutely. Now, we'd love to have you guys on again sometime and talk more and more about digital media and things like that. But
Yeah.
I think we want to wrap it up, and I just want to say that I think what we've learned today is you have a 11 commandment rules for your company.
Yeah,
and I think we've found why Emmis is so successful, and because you guys really do live by those commandments, and I don't see that at the other corporate radio.
yeah.
Guys,
This is who we are, and listen. At our ages, you're talking to two guys over 70. One of us is significantly over 70, and we are who we are, and I'm proud of it. We and I, he and I have said 1,000 times. Other people may do it other ways. This is who we are, and we're proud of who we are. And obviously, Rick and I have been together almost 50 years, and we have been, I mean, trust is the most elementary part of any human relationship, and I don't think there's anybody I could trust more than him. And he doesn't trust me at all, but that's another story. But I mean, trust is the most important thing, and your integrity and have some fun. And we've done all those things. So I'm proud of it. I'm very proud of what we did.
and your executives and your employees seem to stay with you forever. So
Yeah.
it has to be a good environment. I commend you for that.
It's really amazing. I mean, like I said, Rick was employee number 2. People who have been here a long, long time. I think the thing that most gratifying is that when people leave and they do something else, and they'll send me a note and say, "It's still the best place I ever worked." I learn more there. I've had so many incredible comments about the book, about what I learned at Emmis, and those are the things that really matter. It's been very, very gratifying.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up on that note, and we can't thank you enough for sharing your experiences and making us understand that corporate radio doesn't have to be like the other people are doing with their entities. So
Thanks.
we appreciate you guys, and hopefully we can get you back on again as things move forward, because you guys haven't. You say you're at an advanced age as I am, but you seem to be moving on, continuing with new things and new ideas, and we really appreciate you joining us
Welcome
today.
back anytime.
This is fun. I got to
Thank
say,
you, Mike. Thank you, Richard.
We, as you can tell, we enjoy this, so we'd do it again. It's
Well,
fun.
we talk about this show being for radio geeks, so
Yeah.
welcome to the family.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.